Hello and welcome to Archaeology 101. Today we are talking about a disease that struck fear into the hearts of people from the later medieval period and right up until the mid-20th century. It was debilitating, disfiguring and deeply shameful. And as we'll see from the archaeological and historical records, its dark reputation is well earned. The disease in question was syphilis. And before we begin, I will issue a quick warning as we are going to be getting into fairly graphic detail and there will be illustrations and some photographs as well which are rather unpleasant. So if you're squeamish, I've warned you now. Let's dig in. Syphilis has gone by many names over the centuries. The Great Pox, the French disease, the Italian disease, the Christian disease. The names go on and on, often depending on which nation or religious faction wanted to blame someone else other than themselves for the disease. Its formal name is Treponema pallidum subspecies pallidum, and it's a venereal disease primarily passed through sexual contact. The disease is caused by a very strange-looking, spiral-shaped, wormy-like microorganism which is known as a spirochete. Once this microorganism enters the human body, it will go on to trigger a whole host of extremely unpleasant symptoms, some of which unfold over years in a person's life. These symptoms are precisely what make syphilis important to archaeology, as they bear physical marks on the human body. But we have to go into some rather gory details before those symptoms manifest on the human skeleton. Syphilis progresses in several stages, the first one known as primary syphilis. So at the initial site of infection, this is usually the genitals, there will be a raised ulcer-like sore which is known as a canker. This is often painless and it will then disappear on its own after a few weeks, and it gives the sufferer the false impression that the infection has cleared, but it hasn't. Next comes secondary syphilis, and this occurs weeks or sometimes months later after the initial infection. And this will manifest as a widespread rash which covers large parts of the body, and this includes the hands and the feet. You can also catch syphilis off someone by coming into contact with these sores. Very much like the first stage, secondary syphilis also fades on its own over weeks or months, much to the victim's relief, I'm sure. After the secondary stage, the bacteria can remain dormant within the human body, sometimes for years, and this is called latent syphilis. At this stage, outward symptoms more or less disappear, and the infected person becomes much less infectious through sexual contact. And for some people, the disease never progresses beyond this point, and they remain asymptomatic. But for others, the worst is yet to come. Roughly a third of untreated syphilis patients go on to develop what is called tertiary syphilis. This stage can appear anywhere between a year to even several decades after the initial infection. At this point, the disease causes a devastating array of symptoms. Lesions can form across the face and body and attack the internal organs, including the brain. This is known as neurosyphilis, which can result in a plethora of symptoms such as blindness, epilepsy, and insanity. It is at the tertiary stage that syphilis leaves its mark on the human skeleton, what we would call pathology, and this pathology survives long after death and burial, and we pick that up in the archaeological record. So it is at the tertiary stage where syphilis becomes relevant to archaeology. The study of disease and its impact upon human remains falls under Palaeopathology, the study of ancient illness through skeletal evidence. Before modern genetic testing, the diagnosis of syphilis in archaeological remains relied entirely on looking at characteristic changes to the human skeleton. This is not an easy task, as many diseases can produce similar damage to the skeletal system. However, tertiary venereal syphilis does cause one characteristic symptom, which is called caries sicca. Caries sicca is evidence of where the spirochetes have started to attack the bone of the skull. When bone encounters disease like venereal syphilis, which do start to try and infect the bone, it can only respond in two ways, and that's by taking bone away or by laying down new bone. And as that bone attempts to heal at the site of an infection, another lesion will form next to that one. And this creates a continuous cycle of destruction and partial healing. And it produces an effect known as a worm-eat in appearance across the skull. There's all these little craters across the skull where the spirochetes have been active and then have been fought off. It's rather horrible. But tertiary syphilis will not just attack the skull, but it will create destructive changes which are visible throughout the skeleton. And this particularly seems to impact the skull, the shins, and the ribs. This individual that you see here was buried at St Oswalds Priory in Gloucester, and they show very clear evidence of caries sicca above the left eye and on the crown of the skull. Some of these bony lesions on this individual shows that the disease was active, meaning that they were probably in chronic pain and there were visible lesions and sores on their body at the time of their death. We rarely get to determine the precise cause of death from an individual skeleton. However, syphilis can eventually be fatal, often through extensive damage to the central nervous system or hemorrhaging of major blood vessels. In prolonged cases like this individual at Oswalds Priory, it is entirely likely that syphilis directly contributed to his death. Syphilis has one more horrific adaptation, and that's its ability to cross the placental barrier. So a pregnant woman who is infected with venereal syphilis can pass the disease to her unborn child. This does not always prove fatal to the fetus, but it frequently results in miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death. But those who survive will continue to experience symptoms of syphilis. And this historic account is a painting by Rembrandt, and it depicts Gerard de Lerasse, himself a highly accomplished 17th century Dutch artist, who is thought to have suffered from congenital syphilis, which is deduced by his disfigured face. And you can see he's got a rather odd nose. That's a collapsed nose known as a saddle nose, and it's a classic feature of symptoms of syphilis. Children who survive into adulthood often display numerous and widespread skeletal and tooth abnormalities and other extreme symptoms affecting their soft tissue. There are lots of very graphic images out there which you can look at if you want to, but I'm not going to show very many of them as, frankly, they are just too horrific. How common syphilis was in the past is very difficult to say because of the way later stage syphilis operates. It's important to note that the skeletal changes associated with tertiary syphilis are actually quite rare. Estimates suggest that only around 20 to 30% of infected individuals will ever go on to develop things like bony lesions. This means that syphilis rates in the past are almost certainly hugely underestimated if one relies on overt paleopathological symptoms alone. So how do archaeologists look into identifying syphilis on individuals from the past? We now have a range of techniques to investigate diseases like syphilis, which includes things like X-rays, CT scans, microscopy, microscopes, and more recently, ancient DNA analysis. Extracting ancient DNA from syphilis bacteria is exceptionally difficult. Spirochetes are so fragile, and they're organisms which don't have a hardy outer coating, unlike some other bacteria like tuberculosis, which I quit. My point is, syphilis is not good at hanging around after their host dies. They can be destroyed by things like exposure to light and heat. As a result, only a handful of studies have claimed to successfully identify ancient syphilis through ancient DNA extraction, and this area of research for this disease specifically is very much in its infancy, and many studies will still rely on the old method of just looking at paleopathological changes to identify syphilis. The origin of syphilis has been one of the most hotly debated topics in archaeology, and it's been going on for decades. The disease appears in European historical records after Christopher Columbus's return from the Americas in 1492, and as part of the Columbian exchange, they exchanged between America and Europe people, animals, crops, and their diseases moved in between the old and the new world. For a long time, the dominant theory was that syphilis originated in the Americas, and Columbus's crew of dirty sailors brought that back over to Europe in what is called the Columbian hypothesis. However, others have argued the complete opposite. Syphilis already existed in Europe and was instead carried to the New World, much like smallpox, and this is called the Pre-columbian hypothesis. A third idea is the Unitarian hypothesis, which suggests that syphilis, or things very much resembling syphilis, existed in both regions, and simply the disease became more aggressive in Europe around the time of the 15th century. This debate remains unresolved, partly because syphilis heavily shares genetic similarities with other similar diseases in a family called treponemal disease. These diseases also include things like yaws and endemic syphilis, and this issue is also exacerbated by what we spoke about with the problems surrounding ancient DNA extraction. However, one of the most recent updates in this case is that an international team from the Max Planck Institute claimed to have identified genetic evidence for now extinct strains of treponemal diseases in South American skeletons that predate European contact. These findings strongly suggest that treponemal diseases as a whole, which are closely related to syphilis, were present in the Americas long before 1492. This does not rule out presence of syphilis within Europe or Asia, so the picture is far from clear just yet. even though syphilis's origins are unknown, for Europe syphilis would become a very real problem and a major epidemic at the end of the 15th century. One of the earliest recorded epidemics occurred in 1495 amongst the armies of Charles VIII of France during his invasion of Italy, which started at the end of 1494. The army was made up of international mercenaries and were accompanied by large numbers of prostitutes, which created ideal conditions for rapid transmission, and the army themselves were also committing mass sexual crimes amongst the local population, which unfortunately also made the disease spread. It was at the decisive Battle of Fornovo in July of that year that the Italian physicians identified a disease later known as syphilis, covering the bodies of many of the dead on the French army side. The disease quickly spread across Europe and it affected all levels of society, including royalty. No one was safe. Syphilis was often described as venereal leprosy during its early phases due to its physical resemblance to true leprosy, which makes distinguishing these two diseases from medieval texts and imagery very difficult. We won't ever know the true extent of the syphilis epidemic on Europe. However, one study has looked into the admittance rates of syphilitics into London hospitals, and by looking at those admission rates, they've identified that maybe 20% of London was infected by the disease. This might not be as ridiculous as it sounds, as we know that syphilis is quite a tricky disease, as it has that strange pattern of appearing and then disappearing temporarily and then only to spring up again. So it would be very easy to spread the disease, and most importantly, there was no cure. There was only one treatment widely accepted in Europe, and that was mercury. Mercury was first introduced as a treatment for syphilis in the early 1500s, and it would go on to be used for nearly 500 years, and including into the early 20th century. Mercury does have some antimicrobial properties, and it may have alleviated some of the early stage symptoms in some cases. However, because syphilis naturally enters its latent phases, it probably means that the so-called recovery just coincide with the disease becoming dormant. Mercury treatment was brutal, and it included things like ointments, oral doses, inhaling the vapors, and in one particularly horrifying 18th century method for male victims, it was to inject mercury directly into the urethra. I cringed so hard when I first heard that, and now all you have to as well. The side effects of mercury treatment were severe: excessive salivation, tooth loss, organ failure, neurological damage, and death. In many cases, the cure was probably worse than the disease. There is little clear archaeological evidence for mercury treatment, as many of its effects do not preserve on the skeletal remains themselves. Some studies have attempted to detect elevated mercury levels within the bones, but these are rather difficult to separate from environmental contamination, particularly in industrial societies in the 1700s, 1800s, when mercury contaminants were commonplace from factory buildings, for example. The clearest evidence we have are the harrowing images that the contemporary artists were making at the time of medical scenes that encapsulate the pain and the misery of the afflicted. And there was also that age-old warning that was born with mercury treatment: a night with Venus and a lifetime with Mercury. To recap what we've gone over today, syphilis has a long and complicated relationship with humanity which we're only just about beginning to understand. Its origins remain very much debated. Whether it arose in the Americas, Europe, or it evolved from earlier treponema diseases and was established across the globe already, we don't know. What we do know is that by the end of the 15th century, syphilis became far more aggressive, maybe because it entered populations with no prior immunity to it, or perhaps some other microbial switch that just came online and the disease mutated. The damage to the skeletal system that it leaves behind is genuinely horrific, as are those images that were from contemporary artists, and it should make us all extremely thankful that we live in the era of modern antibiotics. Effective treatments for syphilis wouldn't begin to appear until around 1910 with the discovery of salvarsan, and then eventually in the 1940s with penicillin. But before that, you had to live with syphilis your entire life until it eventually claimed you. Unfortunately, syphilis cases have actually been rising for decades, and as with many diseases, antibiotic resistance is increasing and has become a real concern. However, it is also possible that archaeological research is one of the things that helps to combat drug-resistant microbes. So you'll better be thankful for my hard work, because my back absolutely kills. Thank you very much for watching. What an absolutely grisly topic. Whenever someone asks me, if I had a time machine, where would I go? And I have a very boring response to that, which is yesterday. I'm not going back before antibiotics. Thank you very much. Doesn't stop me, however, from having morbid curiosity into ancient diseases. And going through this video, it reminded me that back in my undergrad days, I was quite interested in studying syphilis because of its distinct pathology for coursework topics. And I must have brought up that I was fascinated by this one too many times, and my bone lecturer said to me in front of our group once, "You're very into your syphilis, aren't you? Are you trying to look up your symptoms?" And honestly, how do you even come back to that? But that's where I'm going to leave it today. Thank you very much again for watching, and I'll hopefully see you on the next episode of Archaeology 101.